think all of you know something of his background. Ginsberg was trained at Penn and got his law degree at Georgetown, and has been a very prominent member of a major law group in Washington, D.C., Patton law firm. He is very much involved in political law, in public policy, in litigation. He works as a lobbyist for and did for the Bush-Cheney campaign. He's going to be talking to us about a lot of those sorts of activities, and I think rather than extending the introduction, we'll let you tell us in greater detail some pieces of that you've enjoyed the most and be instructed to this group. Our class members come from around the country, from 11 different states, and represent not just political backgrounds, but interests in a broad variety of business, professional, and nonprofit organizations, and so forth as a part of that. And so we're in the second semester of the first year of operation of the school. This is a school basically about global leadership, and the focus is very much about development in the broadest sense: political development, economic development, social development, rural development, international development, community development in a broad sense. So start out, and we'll receive anybody we'd like to know.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you all for having me down. It's really an honor and a treat to be able to do this. I got to spend a semester last year at the Institute of Politics up in Berkeley doing much more of this, and frankly found it far more enjoyable than the regular practice of law. So I'm thrilled to be able to come down to be able to spend some time with you. Actually, what I'd love to do is go around the table. I know you told me your names, but sort of tell me a little bit about what you're studying, and what really interests me is sort of what you were doing before, why you wanted to come to the school, and what you hope to be doing afterwards. You get to go first.
Well, as I mentioned, my name's Erica Hall, and I'm a northerner like yourself. I'm from Connecticut, spent most of my life there. Went to Trinity College in Hartford, and ended up, even though it was liberal arts and pretty much everything there interested me to some extent, but I ended up settling on double majoring in English and sociology. After that, I did Peace Corps service in Jamaica, and as a result of that experience, actually moved quite a bit to the center as far as political ideology goes, surprisingly. And I was planning to go to law school when I got back, and had some last minute jitters while I was applying, because I kept meeting a lot of miserable attorneys. So
Attorneys who are miserable.
yeah, exactly. And so I ended up running a bed and breakfast for 4 years.
Oh.
And that was kind of interesting. In Mystic, Connecticut, by Foxwoods Casino. But found myself often through, just slipping into these political and issues of the day conversations with guests, and being very opinionated, and realizing that wasn't entirely appropriate for a business where people are kind of trying to forget what's going on in the world and have just a nice time, and realized that I wasn't getting the intellectual stimulation, and also I wasn't being able to engage in these issues that I cared about. So started thinking about following through on that law school goal, and then read about this opportunity and said, wow, that's amazing to be on the ground floor in the inaugural class of a new presidential school, and the doors it might open and what it might lead to, and in conjunction with possibly later going to law school. So here I am in the summer. I'll be working interning with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Oh, that's great. And you are so good.
I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. After college, I served 2 years with the AmeriCorps National Civilian Community Corps, one as a Corps member and one as a team leader. Following that, I stayed in Denver, Colorado for a year working on a nonpartisan voter registration campaign. And then I was in biodynamic farm. I came here because I wanted a graduate program that would focus as much on field work and the actual doing of service as the academic side of it. So I wanted to explore service learning.
David Morrissey. I'm a lifelong Kansan, and after I went to college in Kansas at Washburn University in Topeka, a degree in English, which was emphasis in writing and journalism. After college, I worked for a national book retailer for a number of years, and then really wanted to apply my skills in the nonprofit sector. And so I've worked both for a regional AIDS project in eastern Kansas that was serving both rural and urban populations with prevention and education, as well as case management. And then followed that with working for the United Way, directing a volunteer center that served about 135 different nonprofits and charities. I was excited about coming to this school to further develop that business acumen that I was developing through both my for-profit and nonprofit administrative work, and also wanting to try some new things. So for my electives, I'm taking courses not only at UAMS and in healthcare systems and administering human services programs. So for my internship this summer, I'm going to Vietnam. I'll be based in Ho Chi Minh City, assisting grassroots organizations that serve the disabled, helping with grant writing, outreach in English, as well as sort of organizational consulting work. I'm excited.
My name is Dawn Zekas. I'm originally from South Dakota. I have my undergraduate degree in biology and social work with a minor in chemistry from the University of South Dakota. Following college, I served in the AmeriCorps Vista program at my alma mater, working on service learning and civic engagement issues in an effort to connect the campus with the community to avoid some of the problems that take place in a smaller campus sort of community. Applied to several graduate programs, mainly in the interest of public health, particularly in rural areas. My interest has always been in trying to find a way to engage citizens towards community empowerment for overall health and wellness. And Dr. Bruce convinced me that this was the place that I could combine both those interests and be more effective in what I might do in the future, which obviously lies in rural healthcare and in working to build community empowerment in that area. This summer, I will be serving with the Clinton Foundation HIV/AIDS Initiative through the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, working on the HIV/AIDS Initiative.
Which part of South Dakota?
I'm from Isabel. It's a tiny town in central northwestern part of the state. Thank you.
Greg Holyfield. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. History major from the University of Georgia. So I'm Southerner. I was a Peace Corps volunteer also. I was in Mali in West Africa. After returning from Africa, I went to work on Capitol Hill. I worked for Congressman Bart Gordon from Middle Tennessee, and I worked for Senator Mark Pryor from the great state of Arkansas. I was wanting to go to graduate school, and this opportunity came up, and I just said, let's go. I have family here, and so I'm interested in democracy development in some of these countries that are making the transition. And this summer I will be moving to Sri Lanka, and I'm going to be working on these 6 different villages and helping them with these microcredit projects and making sure they're running and operational when the grant money runs out.
I'm Amber Holloway. I was raised here in Arkansas, and I graduated from high school, and then I moved to Texas, and I had the opportunity to join AmeriCorps at that point, and I worked for 2 years in a high school doing crisis intervention and dropout prevention of high school students, and that really set me on the path to public service, and it was a great experience for me. So when I started college at the University of Texas at Austin, I was kind of looking for different things to do. I majored in the Planting Honors program, and then I worked for Teach for America at their Los Angeles Summer Institute. And then I served as the ombudsman my final year at the university. And then I ended up coming here. So this was kind of a great way for me to combine my interest and the public service work I did before working with James Lee Witt in Washington DC.
Oh, good.
doing crisis.
Doing a lot of interesting work.
My name is Alicia Rosales. I graduated from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 1998 with a double major in Spanish and Latin American Studies. Went out and worked for a couple Fortune 500 companies before I decided to go to law school. I received my JD a year ago from Nebraska as well. Had accepted a job with the Missouri State Public Defender and had applied to this at the same time. Had accepted the job and turned around and called it back when I was accepted because I was interested in the community piece. Especially things like delivering democracy is kind of developing as an interest as I've been here, how to use different kinds of ADR methods to make sure that more people are included, as well as how to use ADR on individual basis rather than litigation. As well as what I did mostly in law school was worked on increasing ethnic diversity in the legal profession and how to keep people of color in the legal profession as they're in it. And those are my continuing interest, and I'll be doing some of that work at Notre Dame Law School this summer as an assistant director of their services for public members.
I'm Nancy Mencia. I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, and following graduation from high school, I went to school in San Diego at U.S. International University. It's a small private school. And after that, I got selected as part of the Deutsche Bundestag at the U.S. Congress Exchange for Young Professionals, and I went to Germany to resettle refugees. And then I went to graduate school in Holland, the University of Amsterdam. I studied international relations there. And yeah, I did a lot of work on the field in former Yugoslavia, working on refugee issues also, and their expected entrance into the EU and post-conflict development. And then yeah, I started a small business in Holland. Then I returned to the Americas, lived in Mexico for a bit, and managed a business in San Diego, and then started to look at what was going to be my next step in my life. So I started meditating and trying to see the sign, and I saw the inauguration of the library here, and I knew that I had to be here. So I plan to kind of continue non-governmental organizational work. And, this summer I'll be working for a microfinance institution. So I'd like to concentrate on minority integration issues, but through micro enterprise development or socioeconomic development.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ginsberg. My name is Malcolm Glover. I'm from Bowie, Maryland, the great state of Maryland, actually. South of the Mason-Dixon line, but we did secede from the Union, so depends on the day. A little bit country, a little bit rock and roll.
You get to choose a lot of
North to south. From Bowie, Maryland, I'm actually a graduate of Florida A&M University in the field of journalism. And actually, my father and I went to view FAMU's campus in the fall of 2000. And FAMU is in Tallahassee.
Oh, I do indeed.
And so, to drive past Judge Sanders Saul's court to see all of the news reporters down there during the counts and the recounts, it was a phenomenal experience for a student who wanted to become a student journalist. And I've also been a production assistant for the City of Tallahassee Television, for MSNBC and Hardball with Chris Matthews, and I've done humanitarian work in China and Brazil. And while serving as the Director of Public Relations for the honors program at my university, I happened to tune into the inaugural festivities and went to the Clinton Center website. I've always been interested in international affairs and politics. And I noticed the link on there for the Clinton School of Public Service, and read about it, and decided why not apply. I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school for international affairs, and but this seemed to be the best fit, a mixture of it all. And so the rest was kind of history. This summer I'll be working with Windrock International with their programs in Southern Sudan. I'll be monitoring some of the USAID initiatives over there, and I'll also be filming the life stories of some Sudanese who live there and show how Windrock has impacted and positive impact on their life. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Katie Snodgrass. I'm originally from Arkansas and went to the University of Mississippi for undergrad. Graduated with McDonald-Barnes College there. I, after graduating, was planning on going to graduate school, but instead ended up volunteering for a campaign, which was something I never thought I would do as an undergraduate, because so many of my classmates were going into politics. I didn't want to do it. And, but volunteered and then became the campaign manager for the current mayor of Oxford, Mississippi. Worked with him in City Hall for a few years. And then I ran an independent bookstore for a few years prior to coming here. And this summer, because I had had a taste of public service, and I guess I just wanted to get back in it. This summer, I'm going to be working for the Global Industry in their membership and commitments office in New York.
Good afternoon, my name is Joe Ballard. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, graduated from Creighton University with a double major in cultural anthropology and justice and society. Joined AmeriCorps on the same program as Erica, National State Community Corps for 2 years, and served the years in AmeriCorps just teaching, working in inner city schools in Kansas City. Kind of just found the Clinton School randomly, applied randomly, not thinking I would get in, and a year later, here I am. I'm planning on spending the summer in Kabul, Afghanistan, working for a small local NGO that does literacy and education projects in the city of Kabul and around the country. Pretty excited about that. And I'm interested in going to law school after I'm done with this program. Weighing it heavily, but.
We should talk about that.
Too much to be done.
Isn't this a boring group?
Well, it's so impressive, all the things you're doing. I mean, they're really interesting situations, all with great opportunities. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has on any of the various political wars I've been in, which sort of range from redistricting in the 1990s that kind of brought about the Republican Revolution to the fun in Tallahassee, which is one of those situations you think you'll never ever be in your entire life, to the 2004 campaign and little run-in with the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. But I've been extremely lucky in my sort of law career, because if you're a campaign lawyer, which is what I really do, you're kind of a techie. I mean, you helping people comply with laws. Campaigns are really like small businesses today, startup businesses. They go up and down in 18 months. They spend millions of dollars. They've got employment issues and contract issues and all the usual things of small business. But I've also gotten to sort of get involved in these bonus issues that really have had their impact on the political landscape of the country. But I thought I'd start out just talking a little bit about what we also do at Patent Box, which is lobbying, because all of the things that you all are involved in are wonderful programs, and for better or for worse, you're going to need the United States government at some point, in all likelihood, to either come up with a law that makes life better for the people you're involved with, or because you need money from the government, one way or another. And what Washington and lobbying is like is something that I'm not sure I can really adequately describe, no matter how much time we have. Senator, I know you've seen it from your side, but it's a mysterious process. And it's mysterious in large part because even in the relatively short amount of time that I've been in Washington, the 15, 20-year period, it's just gotten much more complicated. That the idea of turning a bill into law just seems much more complicated because of the dynamics. And the things that you have to do to get a bill into law involves, unfortunately, I think, much more than just the merits of the law. Because what you see as the merits of the law, somebody else somehow is going to see as a detriment in the law. And so what lobbying in Washington is like today is a combination of a number of things. Number one is substance. You're going to have a law, you got to be able, or a policy position, you have to be able to tell people why it should be enacted into law. And I think it's always surprising to me from where I see it. It must be even more surprising for the members of the House and Senate administration to see the absolute awful arguments and justifications for laws and for policies that come behind it. That it's more than just feeling passionately about an issue. It's being able to convince a truly diverse ideological, intellectual group in Congress and in administration of why it's the right policy. And so the way that you present those arguments really does matter. The second thing that's true is that you got to know the right people. So much of what goes on in Washington is based on relationships, because the volume of what goes into Congress or an administration is so great that just as a matter of human nature, people tend to put greater stock in things that they know from people they know. So when you go up to lobby, you've got to have friends to push. And we get in this argument frequently on lobbying projects. Somebody will say, well, we have a bill, we need to go see all the committee chairs. And that's the way we'll get our bill passed. And knowing committee chairman is not enough, because committee chairmen probably have a minimum of 20 to 25 meetings a day. It's always somebody asking for something, and that simply isn't enough. But you also need advocates within the body. So you have to talk to people who will care about your issue, who are senators or members of Congress, or people in the administration, and are willing to put some of their capital into telling people that it's true. The other part of the process that has become greater and greater is grassroots activity. Members tend to respond if their constituents call them up and tell them something matters. Now, that may not be true on sort of big picture issues like abortion or raising taxes, but on particular issues that will mean something to an individual community. Members hearing from people in their states and in their districts really does matter a lot. And so that is also part of being involved in an advocacy organization. It truly is important to be able to localize all the issues that you have in Congress. And then the simple fact of the matter is Tommy Boggs, who is the patron saint of my law firm and one of the real old-time lobbyists of Washington, really refers to what goes on in the town is the human chess game. Because so much of it is the way people feel about other people and the way the mood they got in, the mood they're in when they got up from bed that morning. And what's a priority to one person and what somebody's willing to trade for something else that means something to them. So the human chess game is all part of it. And I raise this not because I think this is any great answer to anything, but just because I sense today there are more and more people who are frustrated with the process and with being able to get what they feel and are correct about are really, really good ideas and programs actually enacted into law or adopted by policies. And it just seems to be tougher and tougher these days. And so to get your ideas really sort of running through the body politic, I think those essential ingredients are necessary to make it all work. Have any of you lobbied before, actually been up to Bill or state legislatures when you worked there for a while? What were your experiences from?
The day I lobbied, I was lobbying on behalf of the Points of Life Foundation and the National Volunteer Center Network. They called for it was a Senate Intelligence Bill vote, and so every appointment I had made was scrapped with my delegates because they were all on the floor. So all my visitations went to LA's, and I did follow up correspondence with them, sort of getting back per se. That bill ended up, that proposal ended up sort of getting scrapped in light of the budget constraints anyway. So.
Yeah, so it's a frustrating.
Yeah, it was a great learning experience for me, and I relished that actually, being
launched it, so excited.
Yeah, I mean, people love coming to town, what you do is important, you gotta make it work also, especially as you sort of, what was your experience?
I went to DC when I was a sophomore in college, that summer before my sophomore year in college, and lobbied on behalf of the Orphan Foundation of America. We met with our Congress officials there were 12 of us from 12 different states across the U.S., met with them, and it was just very exciting because it was my first time, actually it was my second time in DC, but my first time actually in the House chambers, and it was kind of more the big kind of awe sort of feeling. But in high school, in college, I also lobbied in our state house for higher education bills that were currently under season. My university takes the annual trip. They call it Shed Days. It's Students for Higher Education Days, and they load up a big van of kids and take them up to the Capitol for a couple days and lobby and talk to their senators and representatives.
What was your perspective from working on the state?
I was on the other side, and so I would have, my issues were agriculture, immigration, and international relations. And so I had a lot of farmers, tobacco farmers was a big deal when I was there, the tobacco buyout. And a lot of that is, a lot of it's preaching to the choir. You just say, we understand, we're behind you. We did have some immigrant people that just hated immigrants came in one day and were, they were very, very, very vocal. And you just have to try to, you're representing, you're not representing yourself, you're representing congressmen, and say we understand and we'll take it into consideration. And there's some very, I loved it. You meet some great people. My perspective was that like you said, if they're from your district and they've got a personal relationship, it weighs a lot more than somebody just kind of coming out of the hallway just saying, hey, we'd like to talk to you about the pandas in China. That's where you say, okay, thank you. Move along.
Yeah. Anybody else doing anything? Bobby?
Actually, in 05 and 04, spring of 05 and 04, I attended APAC's National Policy Conference. And so part of that, at the end of the conference each year, is a lobbying trip to the Hill. And for that experience, for me, it was a little more about clout. Because it wasn't necessarily, in terms of the congressmen and senators or their staff, it wasn't necessarily that you were from their district or from their community. They recognized that APAC is a powerful lobby who backs up what they say. And so usually that was the deal. But the interesting thing was that lobbying wasn't really done on that trip. The lobbying was always done the night before at the banquet, with just about everybody in Congress was at the Washington Convention Center. And that kind of, locked it up right there. And then in Florida, I worked, my sophomore year, I worked for a state senator, Gary Sibley. And so that was my opportunity to be on the other side of the fence. And it was interesting. It was a little bit different in the state of Florida. I think that was my first experience where I said, wow, like these guys, and maybe you're not supposed to, but there's a lot of gifts. There are a lot of gifts that can change hands, and it doesn't even have to be the big thing. I mean, a lot of chocolate.
Not in every state, but in Florida.
Yeah, in Florida. Yeah, and it's the kind of stuff that adds up. So that was interesting to me.
If anybody ever wears a wire in the state of Florida, they'll be dropping like flies.
My experience was a little different because I did it at the state level, and the personal relationship thing that worked well in my favor was that my grandfather had always run this one state senator's campaigns, for 40 years kind of thing. And so Paul Hartnett had called around, and especially being in the town hall with only 47 people, and everybody respected this man and said, she's, Joe's granddaughter, and my other side of the family is also very well known for my last name, and so that was what got me into doors and got me listened to. Was that aspect. So, and because it's such a small state that my last name wasn't exactly unheard in politics.
Senator, what's your impression of how to lobby effectively and get get ideas actually enacted into law.
I think even more key than knowing the senator or the congressman or knowing the staff people. Dr. Bruce and I, for example, went up 2 or 3 weeks ago. We went up with the dean of the Bush One School, Bushward, from Texas A&M. And we had an extensive day of lobbying. We didn't get to see Kay Bailey Hutchinson, but we saw her chief of staff. We didn't get to see, we did see Blanche Lincoln. We did not see Mark Pryor. We were afraid, because of Abramoff, we were afraid of a conflict or something. So we bypassed his office, but Blanche said
Usually
she
it's
was
the
going.
kids lobby in the Senate.
Yeah, right. She was going to drive him home that evening, or because his car was in the shop, and she was going to lobby Mark for us. So anyway, it's networking, but it's staff, I think, Ben, is as much or even more than knowing the member, the House member or the Senate member. But those staff people are so critical. It's just, I think that's where it is. That's really what I think.
We're the biggest lobbying shop in town, and quite deliberately, we hire people at every age range that there is. I mean, we're always really excited to get people who are 24, 25, 26 who've worked on the Hill for 2 years, just as much as we are to get staff directors from the biggest committee. Because what we actually find is that there are a series of networks, and it all tends to be aged, actually. And what the senator says about the staff is absolutely right. You never quite know if that's chief of staff or the legislative correspondent who's really going to make a difference. And so we I mean, quite deliberately hire in all of the sort of strata and food groups from the Hill and the administration, and that's just the way it is. I mean, it's not like the old days where if you knew a couple of senators, you could get anything done. It's just changed, and that adds some to the frustration. You also mentioned in passing the Abramoff situation, which is a very interesting phenomenon in our little town. What I think is true about Abramoff is that what he did, and Congressman Cunningham, who is now doing 8+ years of part-time in the federal pen for taking gifts, are, I think, so sort of over the top that it is not at all what most people in Washington do. But it does point out a sort of constant theme that's been gaining credibility in Washington, which is that money rather than merit determines what becomes law, that you actually can buy your way through legislation. So all the reform bills that you now see before the Congress are aimed at the different ways that money is being spent, whether it's the Lobbying Disclosure Act, so you have to report whenever you do anything with a member, or the gift rules that determine meals, or the travel rules that talk about fact-finding trips, or even campaign finance reform, because ironically enough, all the activities that may get banned in any of these lobbying reforms, you can still do in the campaign context if it's a campaign bill. So the whole Washington sort of shell game is a little bit in place. And what I think you're seeing is that the members are putting more and more of a burden on the lobbyists and less of a burden on themselves as the bills sort of wind their way through. But anybody have any questions about any of that fun stuff?
How are you seeing things change? And I mean, maybe some specific stories or something as far as the scale is sort of
It has absolutely changed the behavior of how much interchange there is between lobbyists and staff. I mean, I think lobbying is an honorable and really a necessary profession. And in fact, all interests are special to some degree or another. I mean, it doesn't matter which side of the issue you're lobbying on, whether you're a union or employer or right to life or pro-choice, you bring a perspective to to an issue, that a member and the staff are better off knowing all those different issues and reaching whatever their judgment is. So I think lobbying is helpful to members and their staff at the end of the day. The answer is that there's much less energy. That even although it is still legal for a member or staffer to go on a fact-finding trip paid for by a private source, they're not doing it. Where people used to get together and have a beer after work and talk about life, love, and oh, that bill you're working on. There's much less of that going on than there used to be. It's probably a temporary phenomenon, but it's very much true right now. I'm not sure that affects anything in the, really stops any of the perceived evils in the process. But it's different, and there's very much a different atmosphere.
Do you think that if we inform people better about the administrative process that backs up all those laws, that would help? Because I think that there's a perception that these laws do things to people, and a lot of times it's the administrative regulations that come later. And I never understood any of that until I was in law school, and I don't think the layman really does generally.
I think, look, one of the frustrating parts about this is that to explain the process and how complicated it's become, which is another reason lobbyists actually play a useful function in life, because you can translate the native customs of Washington, basically. It's awfully difficult to wage an education campaign around the issue. I mean, just on the most simplistic level, what people will watch on cable TV is disasters made in murder trials. It's not a substantive discussion of administrative regulations or even laws that actually affect a crime. So the whole, I mean, yes, the answer to the question is yes, but a lot of smart people are spending a lot of time trying to figure out why, and it's one of the real sort of needs.
I'm not one of the lawyers in the class.
Quit bragging.
But I'm wondering, when it comes to law, when it comes to the clients that you accept, do you feel the same way about that as you do about lobbying, that it doesn't necessarily matter what side you're on, you bring a different perspective to the table? Usually when you take on clients, do you agree with their point of view or agree with their message when they come sit down to you and you say, okay, I make the case, or is it a little bit different? Does it matter?
It's different. I mean, for me personally, it's different. I mean, on lobbying matters, there are some positions on issues I wouldn't take, I suppose, but most of the things we do are really not the sort of hot button social issues that you hear about. They're really commercial issues for the most part. Helping out Lucent in its merger with Alcatel so it doesn't become the next Dubai port deal. I mean, that's an easy one to lobby on any side. Right? Helping the Office of Hawaiian Affairs and the Native Hawaiians to try and get the recognition bill through the Senate. That's a little bit different from where some of the members of my party might be, but I kind of believe in the issue, so I'm perfectly comfortable doing it. On the political law side of my practice, I only represent Republicans, I don't represent Democrats. I'm perfectly happy to represent political action committees and groups who want to get involved in the process in terms of walking through the sort of legal requirements, because I think at the end of the day, having more ideas in the political debate is important, and you don't want people tripped up in presenting their ideas because they didn't get the highly technical aspects of the law right. So, I mean.
And I guess to add on to that, I guess the other side of that would be in debate, because I'm not a lawyer, but oftentimes in debates they tell you what you really need to do is know the other argument, because if you know the other argument, then you can get them every time. And so, if you take, for instance, whether it's representing the Swiss Boat Veterans Trooper, representing President Bush and Vice President Cheney in 2000, then governor, and former secretary, and congressman. So, is your objective in those situations to really know what kind of way David Boyce and others are going to argue before the Gore campaign so that you can be on your game?
Sure. Sure. I mean, it's important in everything you do to sort of understand the perspective of people who don't agree with you, even as much as understanding your own arguments.
Because I guess the flip side of that would be, if there were a Democrat who, let's say for instance, came down on the side of a certain ideology that lines up with the Republican Party, and they wanted you to represent them. Maybe it's like a Scoop Jackson kind of Democrat, something like that. And the Republican that they were going against does not line up with the ideology that you profess or that you support. Would you support that Democrat? Would you take on their case?
No, is the answer to the question. And here's why. Because first of all, it never really shakes down in quite those stark terms. I mean, the ideology, you know, an ideology is made up of a lot of different component parts, so you agree with people on something and not the others. But the most important vote from sort of the perspective of a campaign hack lawyer, which is what I am, is the first vote they cast every session, and that's for who the majority leader or the Speaker of the House is. And that goes on ideological lines, and everything else flows from that one vote. So a Democrat's not going to vote for my guy for majority leader or speaker. So that's the answer. I might not work against a Democrat who I agree with, but I want to represent him.
Could I ask you about message? I want to, because I'm a Republican. And if I were going to introduce myself, I'd start with, from graduate school, working on the Panama Canal treaties as my dissertation and watching the new right come along and the truth squads on the canal. And again, a debate with lots of voices, but voices that were so much shrill. And everyone would agree with lobbying as representation. They did representation. But when we talk about a message and we see the nature of the message that is available on controversial issues and during campaigns, and for example, with the Swift Book veterans, not so much light, a lot of heat. And so the discourse we get and the way we talk to each other makes it difficult to leave the table liking each other. And I have a sense of how we got into this. Where's it going? What's your take on, is that making lawmaking more difficult and elections more divisive? Where's that going? You're in the middle of that. Where's it going?
It's really tough to get perspective on that when you're in the middle. I admit that as a human failure. I think that it does make it much more difficult to legislate. It makes campaigns more difficult. It makes it more difficult to govern. And this administration is sort of a perfect example of how it can be more difficult to govern when everything is so extreme. I think that this 20-year period I'm talking about in a broader historical sweep really is a terribly divisive period, and it'll be recorded that way historically. But where I think it may be going is it's a 20-year period in the country's long history. And you can see signs of coming out of that and sort of recognition that you do need to be less divisive and sort of able to reach along party lines. One of the most popular things that George Bush said in the 2000 race was on the Unite or Not Divide. That was a theme that was popular. Now, put aside what you think about governing style for the years afterwards, it was a theme that resonated. It's going to have to come, I think, from one of two things, either a terrible disaster where the country is sort of forced to pull together out of a disaster, which we all hope doesn't happen, or leaders from the top in a presidential election who sort of do that as a theme. Now, there are some people who are like that out there. John McCain is a front runner because he appeals in a sort of bipartisan way. I mean, he appeals in a bipartisan way. There's been a spate of stories in the last 2 weeks about how he's not really like that, and he's really a conservative Republican and not a maverick who sees across lines, but it's still part of his calling card amongst most people. Mitt Romney just signed a health care bill that was in as strong an example as you're going to see somebody reaching across the aisle and working with Democrats in Massachusetts to pass an historic bill that, you know, quibble about the details, but nobody's done that anywhere before. It's pretty exciting. Senator Clinton has driven Republicans crazy by showing up with the likes of Sam Brownback and Bill Frist and a lot of other people to talk about a number of issues. So that amongst the candidates, and Mark Warner governed Virginia with a Republican legislature and managed to get an awful lot done. So you can see in the sort of startup of 2008, candidates who may actually do that. The other theory that is out there that's pretty interesting is that people will argue that whatever this nomination process in 2008 is going to produce is such bitter partisans on both sides that you're going to end up with a Democrat and a Republican candidate who everybody hates, and there'll be a chance for a third party ticket. You can call it the McCain-Giuliani ticket, for lack of a better term, but you can come up with somebody too. And maybe it's the two major parties get so wrapped around the axle on the negative stuff that they end up creating a path for a third party, which is not the way this country usually works, but still theoretically possible. But it is a problem. That's why it's good to have places like the Clinton Library and the Kennedy School and the LBJ School where the partisans from both sides come together and actually talk without beating each other about the head and shoulders.
That's why we're glad you're here.
It's why I'm glad to be here and why it's really good to do.
Just to push you a little bit on something you said. You said that it might take a major disaster or catastrophe to bring us together. How would you say that 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina doesn't play into doing that? I mean, we thought that each one of those for a time period might be that uniting force, and then it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just curious to stretch your brain on that. Just like,
Well, it wasn't a big enough of a disaster, so everybody retreated to sort of their well-worn and not terribly productive traits. I mean, it happened for a good while after 9/11. You know, people stopped blowing horns at each other in New York. But it reverted. I hope it's not the disaster. I kind of prefer the other scenario. It's still wow.
So I'd like to hear a little bit about the whole redistricting thing. Some people call it gerrymandering. It can turn into that. Your Wikipedia entry says that your dog's name is Gerrymander. So obviously both parties do this when they're in power. This is something that people do. Is there a way to? I mean, how do you feel about it? The use of that gerrymandering versus redistricting. What's the difference? And then, is there a way to use it to strengthen democracy, or is it just a divisive thing? I mean, how can it be used? I mean, obviously we have to take things into consideration when populations change, but what about the way it's being used now, and maybe how can we use it for a better purpose?
They really have gerrymandering on Wikipedia?
They
Do you have a dog? This is the real question. Do you have a dog?
Yeah,
It's
is
my
that
dog.
true?
Yeah, it's true. Actually, there was a really funny scene in the way I'll answer that in a second.
Sure.
In the way of Washington. one of my son's best friends and colleagues on the high school baseball team was Ted Kennedy's stepson. And so we did a bunch of things with the Kennedys, and we both brought our dogs to their baseball game on a Saturday afternoon. And there all of a sudden is our dog, Gerrymander, and everybody's. And Ted Kennedy's dog's name is Splash. You do know about that. And so between Gerrymander and Splash, being there for the, I'll take Gerrymander. Anyway, it's, I can't make it up.
Check them out on Wikipedia.
It was on Imus the other week too. Finally got that. It is true. All right, one person's gerrymandering is another person's redistricting. Have any of you been involved in the redistricting process before? It is the most amazing of all the human processes in politics, because people revert to really strange personal desires that they hold really, really strongly. And the human chess game in redistricting is people are fighting for their parents' houses or the home of a rich donor or an airport or a ball field or whatever, a country club, whatever they care about is just remarkable to see. And so you get strange bedfellows across political lines, which is really the story of the 1990s redistricting. I mean, politicians in power will always try and perpetuate their powers, I think is a fair statement. In the redistricting process, however, one of the things that does make sense is to preserve communities so that communities of interest are adequately represented as opposed to being sliced and diced up. Well, what exactly is a gerrymander? If you want to take the state of Texas, for example, which happens to be the one before the Supreme Court, so it's a pretty good example. In 1990, the Democrats ruled the roost, and the Republicans didn't forge the alliances that Republicans forged in most other states with African Americans and Latinos to change the map around under the Voting Rights Act that had been in place for the first time. So the Texas map in 1990 was a gerrymander for the Democrats. And despite increased Republican strength in the state over the 1990s, so Republicans controlled every statewide office. The delegation was 20 to 15, 20 to 13 Democrats to Republicans. You get into 2000, and there's a stalemate with members of the legislature leaving the state, fighting, and the map goes to court. And the court says, we're not going to do much with this, we're going to take the map that was put in place in the 1990s because that's the status quo and therefore a fair map. Well, from my perspective, and I think really any quantitative objective, it wasn't a fair map. It was the 1990s map, it was a heavily Democratic map. Republicans controlled every statewide office in Texas and had much higher vote totals. And so that's when Tom DeLay went into that session that's now led to all the other stuff that's happened and created a map that is far more numerically fair according to the statewide voting totals than what was in place by the court of the 1990s. Now, which one's the gerrymander? So redistricting is, at the end of the day, very much about a power play within certain set rules. And the concept of how the communities of the state should be divided up is just as varied as can be. That goes back to the Voting Rights Act and its implications, speaking of gerrymanders, because racial gerrymanders and political gerrymanders are the two types. Well, the Voting Rights Act amendments passed in the early 1980s very much against the wishes of some Republicans, but signed into law by Ronald Reagan, said that in its simplest form, you can no longer divide racial minority groups because what had historically been the Democrats' pattern of redistricting when they controlled Congress in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s was for lack of a better analogy, a food fight. And what they did was take urban core with racial minority groups, and then an inner ring, which is sort of Democratic white liberal, and then an outer ring of conservative Republicans. And the Democrat style through all those 40 years that they controlled was pizza pies. They draw pizza pie slices out. And that had the result of fracturing the racial minority communities, fracturing the Republican suburban communities, and creating a series of districts that elected white, liberal, suburban Democrats. The Voting Rights Act said you can't do pizza pie slices anymore, you gotta do donuts. And so the communities of interest were preserved. That had the result in the 1990s, when that act was enforced in many states, of doubling the number of African Americans serving in Congress and doubling the number of Latinos serving in Congress. The districts got a little weird looking, because you know what? Housing patterns in this country have been very much de facto and not de jure, and they look, housing patterns are weird in the country. So if you're going to preserve a community of interest and give African Americans and Latinos the strength that they probably ought to have in legislatures, you're going to have what some people will call gerrymandered districts. Now, lots of people have different definitions of fairness in there. But that, in essence, was what happened in the 1990s, redistricting with those gerrymanders. And the result of that Voting Rights Act, where you had to preserve communities, or the racial communities, was that all the numerical minorities increased their representation. African Americans doubled, Latinos doubled, and Republicans took over the Congress. But it ended 40 years of what I would call gerrymanders, and my Democratic friends would call fair districts. So it all kind of depends. The other part of your question is, how do you create better districts? Now, also make a pretty cogent argument that something is really messed up with representational democracy today in the House of Representatives and legislatures, because you have re-election rates of 98% roughly. And the House is supposed to be the body that reflects the winds of the body politic, and it's not happening. That's, I think, because over the last 40 years, the Supreme Court has come up with a series of decisions that really sort of lock in a whole bunch of bad things. One person, one vote. You have to have congressional districts in a state that are exactly the same size, exactly the same number of people, zero deviation. You can't draw neat-looking districts if you have districts of the same size. They're going to look weird. And if you want to preserve any communities and have equal populous districts, they're going to look really weird. You've got the political gerrymandering cases where no matter what districts people draw to lock in a political majority, it doesn't matter. It's not a constitutional violation according to the Supreme Court. So districts for political gerrymandering purposes can look as weird as you want. And then there's the racial gerrymandering cases based on the Voting Rights Act, where the court in recent years has been saying, well, you can't dilute minority voting strength, but on the other hand, if we see weird-looking districts for racial purposes, then that may well be an equal protection constitutional violation, even although a weird-looking district for political purposes isn't. And the result of all this is 98% re-election rates in the House. The Supreme Court has the Texas case up in front of it now. They had the arguments about 3 weeks ago, I guess. That's a case that for the first time in 40 years has all those issues in front of it, where you could deal with one person, one vote, racial gerrymandering, political gerrymandering, the census, you can deal with it all. And so we'll see what the court does. In oral argument, which I went to just because it's sort of like watching a car wreck you can't not watch, they seem incredibly uninterested in mid-decade redistricting, which is what the Democrats were pushing. They seemed completely uninterested in political gerrymandering, or one person, one vote. To the extent they were interested in racial gerrymandering, it was really isolated to 2 districts in the Rio Grande Valley. So while they could completely reverse this whole thing, they're, I think, unlikely to. And the other reason I think they're unlikely to goes back to a tale that was told me in the 1990s when I was doing redistricting in the Republican District. I assembled all the smart Supreme Court scholars I could find to like help me out because I didn't understand all that stuff. So I had lots of Supreme Court clerks and lots of Supreme Court practitioners. And I had a similarly complex theory about a case in the 90s to what I just told you about in 2000. So I was talking to one of them one day and I said, you think they could actually turn around all the case law that they have? And he said to me, no, you don't understand. There's really a lot less going on there underneath those black robes than you think, and they'll never bite off something that big. So we'll see if John Roberts was right when he said that to me 10 years ago. So that was a long-winded answer to gerrymandering in the district.
Like I said, speaking of the Rio Grande Valley, the immigration rallies the last few weeks is really an interesting mix of people who's participating in those from both the left and the right, it seems. You have the Bush guest worker from people who believe in that position, including children of immigrants and Hispanic voters who are trying to conservative, is my understanding. And then you also sort of have this mix of folks on the left who are liking some of the amnesty offer, and they like the promotion of immigration. But there's obviously that's a disconnect between those group and where they're aligning themselves with the two parties and where their representatives are on this issue. I'm just wondering if you have any observations about that, even tie it to the redistricting piece or not.
Then we need to make this the last question because there's a big audience coming in.
Okay, great. It is a little bit of a scramble day. I think it is forming really interesting alliances. I think that what you're really seeing is that the House Republicans who pushed through the Iron Border before them all bill are retreating pretty quickly. And the sort of parameters that were set up in the Senate bill, which really was kind of a bipartisan compromise, is I think more likely to take hold, which is some sort of a guest worker program, generally not called amnesty. And I think it's a balance between, from the Republican perspective, a lot of employers who believe that there's a need in their businesses. A number of Republicans who just believe it's the right thing to do, to allow people into the country, and you're not going to round up 12 million people and start supporting. With at least with a lot of information, both public and private polls, it shows there are a lot of people who don't like a porous border, and think a porous border, and think that needs to be stopped. So that's why I think you've got sort of unusual dynamics and alliances. But my guess is that the rallies have been very helpful in terms of convincing people that you really do have to do something to deal with the problem, and that you really do have to have a bill that's not going to start deporting 12 million people. So I think that there's light at the end of the tunnel, despite the posturing we saw in the last 2 days of the Senate session.
Right, they'll fell apart, right?
Well, it fell apart, but it didn't really fall apart at its core. It fell apart sort of on the margins. It directly fell apart because the Democrats objected to offering amendments to the bill. There were a series of amendments that would have made the bill more moderate, from my perspective, but the Democrats objected to the offering of those amendments. So, my guess is that when they come back, there's a bill.
Tom, I know we've got to go, but can I ask one more question?
You can't say say no to the dean.
To me, immigration, Iran, Iraq, all these problems, they're not our greatest threat. I think that our greatest threat right now may well be the threat of voter participation and the lack thereof, and the absolute breathtaking costs of running for public office today. And I'll give an example. My son, he ran in 2002 for the Senate. Well, I ran, anyway, I would spend about $1 million a year in campaign. Small state, Arkansas. Mark ran, I think he spent $4 million. His opponent spent the same thing, almost all. They're saying now, he's up in 2 years, they're saying now $8 million, maybe $10 million. Where does that money come from? Today, he's out Houston or Dallas or New, I don't know where he is. What's he doing? Is he working for the people? Is he out? No, he's raising money. All of them are raising. The House of Representatives is spending less time today in session than they have at any other time in the history of this country. Why? What are they doing? They're raising money. Now, we've got to do something about this. What do we do? What's the tipping point?
Well,
Is it, if Abramoff isn't it, what is it? I don't see where it's going.
It is an Abramoff, and this is a much longer conversation.
I know,
But
I'm sorry.
I'll give you, here's the short answer. The problem and the reason that's occurring is that we bought into this concept that you gotta limit the amount of money that senators can get in a contribution. The reason your son and all the members are out raising so much money is that the contribution limits are too damn small. That if you can only raise, if you gotta raise $8 million at $2,100 a pope, you've got a problem. You're gonna spend a lot of time raising money. It costs that much money now to put on an ad, to get out your message to the public. If you spend more money, maybe you get more people out. The difficulty seems to me is that we bought into a really flawed concept of how we ought to be funding our elections. McCain-Feingold has, I think, been a long-term disaster, will be a long-term disaster from every perspective imaginable, but especially damaging the role of the political party committees. Because again, in the sort of 2-second solution, you're never going to have, I don't think you can ever support public funding for campaigns.
I never thought I could, but I do now.
Well, I think as
really
long,
do.
I think all the projects that you all talked about, you're going to do this summer that you're going to do, there's going to be less money for those projects from the government, and if there's public funding, because that money is going to go to politicians to run their campaigns. That, at the end of the day, is, I think, not a palatable solution. Because as long as there's a starving mother or a kid who needs clothes, why are you giving money to politicians to run a campaign? Is, I think, an argument that at the end of the day will stop it dead in its tracks. What you could do is enhance the role of the political party committees. And instead of having the federal government as the funding source for campaigns, you would figure out a way to fund the political party committees. You would not have the candidates spending all their time raising money. It might help the party committees from time to time, but you let the party committees raise a lot of money. You let them raise corporate money to pay their overhead costs. And the party committees then fund the campaigns much the same way that the federal government would in a public financing scheme. But that is the exact opposite of what McCain-Feingold has done, and McCain-Feingold has in fact enshrined the public interest, the special interest groups that we're supposed to keep out of the process. I can go on about that.
There's another option of bringing the crowd back here.
Yeah.